Hi, this is Matt Caffrey. This is the third of our videos for folks to watch prior to coming to their first Connection conference. This is the final, and this is the one closest to my heart. It's about the origins and evolution of the Connections conference itself. If you're going to join our community and be part of us, it kind of helps to know where we came from. Next slide. So I always have to start with this. I'm very fortunate to get a chance to be a wargamer as a profession, and part of working for the government is always including a disclaimer. So these are my views and not those of the folks that pay me. Next. So let's start with our origin story. You know, all good things have an origin story, and this one has a bit of a doozy. Connections started on the eve of Christmas Eve in 1992. I was at that time the wargaming research assistant at the School of Advanced Air Power Studies for wargaming, which is a bit of a mouthful, but I did all sorts of stuff for them. Only one of my duties was wargaming, but still, it was in my job title, and it was the main thing that I did. And very prestigious school. I could never be there as a student, but it's basically taking the top graduates of our intermediate service schools and keeping them for a whole nother year to be the Air Force strategists. So it was the eve of Christmas Eve. It was after lunch. I was sitting at my desk trying to figure out what I really needed to do because Christmas Eve was off, and what did I have to do before I left, and how early could I reasonably duck out. And the phone rings, and I pick it up, and it's the Colonel John Warden. Now, from those of you who don't know who he is, he's the author of the book, The Air Campaign, which is a very, very useful book to look at air power, not from shooting your watch or a very tactical level, but thinking about wargaming in campaign terms. And he was also the lead of the planning cell that came up with a plan called Instant Thunder that got transferred to theater and improved and renamed Desert Storm. So a person of legendary stature. He was sent by the Chief of Staff of the Air Force down to Maxwell to take over Air Command and Staff College, really revolutionized the curriculum, started turning out future air strategists. I had been in the same room with him twice, once a very big room, once a small room, but never been introduced to him. I had no idea that he knew I existed. And here he is talking to me on the phone and asking me all these questions about wargaming. Next slide. And he had some real concerns that he had come up with the Instant Thunder plan, and they had run it through a war game. And in that war game, there were absolutely no indirect effects. So he would take down the power grid within Iraq, and there was no effect. He would take down radars, and aircraft would still be as effective. There were no human factors including in it. So a plan that turned out to be very effective, that effectiveness wasn't shown. And if that war game had been persuasive enough, it may have never gotten a chance to be executed. So that was a bit of a problem. And then he comes down to Air Command and Staff College, and he's looking at the war games that we're asking our students to play. And at the time, the interfaces were just horrible. They were, DOS was better. You were taking so much time to learn the interface, you didn't have time to learn strategy. And again, there were no indirect effects being depicted. So he was teaching about indirect effects and about thinking of the enemy as a system, but the enemy wasn't being depicted as a system in his war games. And he commented about how the Air Force really gets bent out of shape because they're worried about distraining in red flag. There are certain rules in red flag that are in place because we don't want to kill pilots in peacetime. So certain altitudes, certain things that you could do in combat, you just aren't allowed to do at red flag because they're too dangerous. And so we put all this time and energy and try to minimizing the effect of distraining in red flag, but yet we have these war games that give you wildly wrong answers being used to train our campaign planners and our future chiefs of staff and all the rest. So he wanted to do something to try to fix both the war games developing strategies and the war games that he would be using to develop strategists. So next. So he asked me what could be done. And I said, well, commercial war games, print war games, computer war games, even miniatures war games are way more straightforward than anything in the military in 1990. So we could learn something from that. Then each of the services is doing different parts of wargaming really well. So we could learn from each other. But he asked me, is anybody doing everything right? And I said, I don't think so. So he said, well, what can we do? And I said, well, maybe we could have some sort of a conference where we could learn best practices from each other. And he said, okay, and asked another question. And I'm trying to listen to his question and come up with a reasonable answer. And meanwhile, in the back of my head is, morning, Will Robinson, you just were asked to put on a conference. And I don't really get a chance to ask any questions. He's if any of you know Colonel Warden, he's a national treasure and very very fast mind. And so finally we get off the phone. It's like 3 hours later, and I never got a chance to see if he really wanted me to put on a conference. And I look around like and everyone's gone. All the faculty, everybody's gone. Some of the lights are out. It's still a little before quitting time, but I'm like, okay, I'm done. And I have this very bad habit. I'm working on it, but when I don't know what to do, I don't do it. So I'm thinking uh, Christmas break. I come back in the new year, and I really don't know what to do. If I ask my boss to ask if I've been asked, is it like I'm asking my boss to ask for me to be volunteered? I can't just walk into the office of the Colonel Warden and ask him, hey, did I hear what you said? And so I'm procrastinating, and I'm walking down the hall of the main Air Command Staff College building, and Colonel Warden's coming down the hall in the opposite direction, and he sees me, and again, I don't know how he knows what I look like, but his whole face lights up, and he says, "Hey, Matt, how's the conference coming?" And I'm like, oh, been giving it a lot of thought, sir. Oh, I have a few minutes now. Why don't we go back to my office? Oh, no, sir. Let me get on your calendar. Well, um, we put it together. We had the first Connections conference just a few months later. And from the very first year, the mission was to advance the art, science, and application of wargaming. And that is very important because some people argue, is wargame an art or a science? And I say yes. Architecture is both art and science. And if it isn't both, it's lousy architecture. Good war games are both. And then a war game is no good unless it gets applied. So the mission has a lot of thought to it. And then right from the beginning in our annual conference, we would have invitational orders to bring in some of the big people in wargaming. There's a joke in the print wargaming community. The best way to have a large fortune is the best way to make a small fortune in wargaming is to start with a large fortune. So a lot of these very prominent, a lot of these big names, they were willing to give of their time, come down to Maxwell, talk to us for free, but they wanted airline tickets. And they particularly enjoyed when they got to sleep in the dead general rooms, the VIP rooms on base. So our target audience were people who were war game practitioners, active duty, uh, contractors, academics, commercial war game guys, any people who are actually doing wargaming. But we also tried to bring in people from other disciplines, areas that were either not wargamed or not wargamed well. Particularly the first 2 or 3 years, we would always have a few blocks trying to educate the wargame designers about air power and the strengths and weaknesses, limitations, applications. And the theory was if we teach them about air power, then they'll just do their own war games more accurately without us spending any money or doing anything, anything uh, as far as paying for it. Um, we also, in the first few years, would always bring in some Hollywood people, and Colonel Warden felt very strongly about that. One of the guys we brought in is a guy by the name of Flint Dilley, who's like the screenwriter for Fightful Goes West and RoboCop 2. More lately, he came up with something that's doing reasonably well. I think it's called Pokemon Go, but anyway, so he would come in and talk about the creative process and all the rest. And then right from the get-go, we wanted a website that would not only be a place where you could learn about the conference, but be a reference and a way of connecting for wargaming. Next. So the very first conference, the very first year, so the mission goes back to the beginning almost as intact. The name doesn't. The very first year it was called the Air Power Education and Wargaming Conference. So you can see why we changed it to Connection. First year was 93. The sponsor was the Air University, actually the commander. The host was Air Command and Staff College, Col Wardens College. It was held at Montgomery, Alabama. And we had 63 participants. We had folks from all four of the services and really the all-stars of the wargaming community. Next. And during the Air University years, we kept making it just a little bit better and a little bit better. Most years, this conference was opened by the commander of Air University. The Lieutenant General who ran it when we got started was a very strong supporter of the Connections Conference. Several different commandants in a row insisted on signing all the invitations to our participants, not using a robo pen, but actually signing all of them as a way of showing their support. After a couple of years, we figured we needed a first timer program because people, the very first connections, we could start with very simple stuff, but people were coming back connections after connections. And if we started with simple stuff, it would be things they already knew. So we had a separate program to begin with. And this year we have this experiment of trying to do most of it online before you ever show up at Connections Conference. Then in 97, we were co-hosted with the Wargaming Institute. The next year they made our demo night much bigger. We basically took over the first floor of the Air Force Wargaming Institute, and they did all the work of recruiting different demos of different war games. We had a full-size simulator show up at the loading dock one year. Interesting. In 2020, our last year in a row at Maxwell, we introduced working groups. And that was because some of the people that were footing the bill for the manpower to make this happen were questioning, what are we getting out of it? So we said, we'll start having these working groups that look at different areas of wargaming that are of concern to the leadership of the organization that's hosting it, Air Command Staff College, the Air Force Wargaming Institute at the time, now the LeMay Center Wargame Institute. So that was started in 02. Also in 02, we shifted demo night to the afternoon so more faculty could come in and see these different war games and perhaps spot something that might be useful in one of their courses. And then after that, we became a traveling conference. Our first year in a different location was up at Rome, New York, at the AFRL's Information Directorate, then Air Force Modeling Simulation Agency down in Orlando. The Air Force Academy sort of hosted us one year. That's a story if you want to bring it up in the Q&A when we're live, first day of Connections Conference. And then a number of other organizations we've been at multiple times. So we've been to, for several years in a row, we co-ran Connections with the Defense Modeling Simulation Conference. We've been to National Defense University several times. We've been to the Air Force Research Lab headquarters and Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Dayton, Ohio, twice. We've been to the Marine Corps at Quantico several times. The LeMay Center Wargaming Institute we were back to once. Army War College did just a spectacular job of hosting us a couple of years ago at Carlisle Barracks. And then in 2020, we were going to be hosted by the Marine Corps. The Marines had some new regulations that made getting non-DoD folks, non-government folks onto base extremely difficult. And in most years, we'd have three or four international participants in Connections. And so that got too hard. So we were going to we switched to being hosted by the Center for Naval Analysis, and then COVID hit. Next slide. So we also have had Connections spread beyond the United States. As I said, most years we would typically have a small number of international participants, but in recent years, we've really spread around the world. Next slide. So in 2013, the United Kingdom stepped up to be the first nation to have a Connections conference outside of the US, held at King's College London. They really figured out how to do it. And if there wasn't a Connections UK, I don't think any of these other ones would have happened. And then the Australians were next. They call their conference Connections Oz. And then Connections in the Netherlands, also a very, very effective conference. I was privileged to be their guest speaker 1 year, and it was just tremendous hosts. Then Connections North, out of Canada, held at McGill University up in Montreal. Wonderful, wonderful conference. Very, very interesting. And then just before COVID hit, or I should say as COVID was hitting, I was in Paris and I was starting to notice some people wearing masks and like what's going on, and the Louvre wasn't as crowded as it normally was. But I just barely got a chance to speak at the very first Connections France. And of course, the French do it differently. They have started just a year or two earlier a serious games conference. And they decided what they really needed to do was hold their Connections conference and their serious game conference concurrently. And this led to some interesting synergies. A speaker before myself was from the Red Cross. And during one of the breaks, he talked to me about how we normally bring the Red Cross in to talk to once the shooting stops. Maybe we should be talking to them as the shooting's going on so that perhaps the fighting could be designed in such a way as there'd be less need for them after the fighting was over. I said, that's a very interesting statement. I need to be thinking about that a little bit more. And so, as I was mentioning before, COVID hit. And so in 2020, we had the only Connections US / Connections Global, the first Connections held online. And all the other Connections conferences have either held their conference online or will in a few months hold a Connections online. So we will eternally be in the debt of the folks from the Center for Naval Analysis because they held our hands. They spent a lot of time and effort and money to get us the kind of professional support we needed to put this online. And of course, as the pandemic continued and telecommuting and all the rest became much more the norm, people got better and better at doing this kind of stuff. And a good friend of mine and valued colleague, Chris Weave, and a guy by the name of Merle and Robinson and several other people put on the first of what I hope is going to be an annual Connections Online. And one reason for that is when we did Connections US Global, we had participation from our allies and our partners, and just not all, but many, many. The first year out, we didn't put in registration what country they were registering from, but people who filled out the feedback indicated they were from 17 different nations. So, and they were only about 10% of the people that filled out feedback. So who knows how many nations participated in 2020. So Chris and his efforts to continue to have an online conference, even when we get back to live connections, will be a real asset, and hopefully bring more people into Connections. And then there's interest from other nations that before COVID hit, several people talked to me and others from the Nordic countries saying that they were looking at starting a Connections conference for their part of Europe. And they're active. The Japanese are actively working, establishing a Connections conference in their nation. We've been in contact, and then I read an article about wargaming in Brazil, and in the article they mentioned that they were planning to start a Connections South. So no one's contacted me, but at least from that one article, it looks like we may be heading south. Next. Okay, so there has been some evolution in the last several years. About 4 or 5 years ago, I think it was Ellie Bartos at one of our hot washes said, I look at the front of the room and the people putting on this conference, and I notice a certain amount of hair pigment challenge. And by that, she meant an awful lot of gray hair. And I'm certainly guilty of that charge. And I looked around, and most of the other people at the podium were, if somewhat more hair pigment than I, not much. And so since then, we've added to the mission of Connections to advance and sustain the art, science, and application of wargaming. Because if we make wargaming better, but those improvements die out with this generation, we really haven't achieved anything enduring. So one of the things that we're doing is trying to upgrade our web page, make tapes like this to try to make sure that Connections endures and that the conference continues indefinitely into the future. Next slide. And then some of the other things so we're continuing to have keynote speakers and panels. We're continuing to have game night, demo night, and now we have a game showcase where some of our guys who really know wargaming will get lots of war games on one topic and kind of demonstrate them. Then we have our working groups that started in 2002 are continuing strong. A lot of them will have a workshop during the conference itself, but the working group often works all throughout the year. Then we have this thing called Game Lab. A gentleman by the name of Scott Chambers came up with several people came up with the idea of a game lab. And the idea was to create a game during a Connections conference. And one of my Canadian colleagues came fairly close to finishing it during a game, finished the game and published it after the conference. But in a few days, you really can't do a game from scratch. So we had this idea of a game lab. We couldn't figure out how to make it work right. And Scott came up with this process. I call it speed dating for wargamers, but it's basically a short period of consultancy. So different folks that are attending the conference have a different topic that they want input from different people in the community on. And you just pick which areas you want to either contribute to or listen to. And it goes on for a short period of time, and then you switch and participate in another game lab. And Scott has just done just an excellent job making this not only productive but fun. And one of the things we're doing it this year virtually. It'll be good. It will be effective. I think you should try it. It's not the same as live. Looking forward to being back to live next year. And then, as I said, we're really trying to upgrade the website. For over 20 years, we've been gonna make the website better. This time it's really going to happen. And we're cooperating with the folks from Wars to create a glossary of wargaming terms that we're going to jointly post references on how to learn more about wargaming, guide to know more, and a lot of different things we're doing to move forward. I talked to the planning committee a couple of months ago saying, you know, guys, I'm mortal, but so are you. So we all need to be trying to figure out ways to make this thing continue. So one of the ways to make it continue is to get more people active. So there's a lot of things that you can do to get benefits from Connections. The most obvious is just learning about war games. Come to Connections, log into Connections, participate, and you'll learn a lot about wargaming. After a while, you'll be able to contribute to making advances in the art and science of wargaming. Or maybe you'll take a war game that the Navy's been doing for years and figure out a way that it can be applied to the Coast Guard or could be applied to the California Highway Department. Maybe you can help us with the year-round reference. I bought my first Apple computer in 1983, so I know a little bit about computers, but I am not a digital native. Some of the younger folks can really help us make the website better. Or if you run an organization, you can be a host for the Connections Conference. If you're hosting, you can select what the theme of that year's conference is, and it can also help you reach out to the larger wargaming community. Our information directorate within AFRL hosted Connections one year because they wanted to make connections with the wargaming community, because that was an area they were planning to move into more. Next slide. So again, to support Connections, volunteer to speak, to wargame, to be one of the co-leads on our conference. If you're an organization, you can support Connections by providing the facility for 1 year's Connections conference. All we need is the facility to run it. We need an action officer that knows where the local, which hotels are good and where we could do our icebreaker. But the best part is hosting costs you zero money, at least zero money coming to us. You know, you're going to have to, your action officer, you're paying anyway. There'll be an opportunity cost because he'll be helping us instead of something else. But in exchange for his hours, you'll get an awful lot of support from the U.S. and to a degree the allied and partner nations that increasingly participate in the Connections Conference. So that's the final pitch for the final talk in this series. I hope the next time you see me, I'll be live and we'll be participating in the Connections Conference, because there's nothing written in stone that the United States, our allies, and our partners will be the ones that wargame most effectively. Our allies, our adversaries, our potential adversaries, wargame. And they put a lot of time and effort into wargaming. And unless we do a very good job, we could very easily find ourselves on the wrong side of who does the best wargaming. And that's how we entered World War II. And the first years were not a lot of fun. We need to stay ahead of the adversaries. And it's not going to be War Connections alone that achieves that. But with your help, Connections can be a big part of keeping us as effective in wargaming as possible. If we do wargaming well, we can save lives. If we do wargaming really well, maybe we can even avoid some wars. Thank you, and hope to see you live at Connections Conference.